Look at verse 1 of chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, that is of Babylon, made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So this image stands about 100 feet tall. It's 10 feet wide. So that's a 10-to-1 ratio. Now, the average ratio of a human being is 5-to-1. So this thing is of extreme proportions that are meant to be impressive. It's most likely an image of one of the Babylonian gods, and most likely Marduk, who was the chief of the Babylonian gods and the patron of the city of Babylon and of Nebuchadnezzar personally. Now, we know from archaeology that such ancient images of this size were made of wood first and then covered with sheets of gold. So that's the idea here. It looks like it's gold because it's covered in gold, but actually the structure on the inside is made of wood. Let's just put it this way. 100-foot tall gold image is going to be mighty impressive, right? And he sets it up in this big open area because he has a plan for it. Look at verse 2. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So, the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So Nebuchadnezzar commands all 8 levels of the Babylonian administration government, all of them from all of the provinces that they've conquered, are to come to the dedication of this image. So finally the day arrives, verse 4, then a herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages. You see, these are all the realms the Babylonians have conquered to this point, that at the time that you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and, what? Worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. So Nebuchadnezzar puts a huge band together for this dedication. As they've all gathered there, standing on the plain before the image, a herald gives the command that when the music plays, everyone is to bow and worship the image. Those who fail to bow will be executed in a most excruciating manner. Now, why Nebuchadnezzar does this is not spelled out for us. But reading between the lines, we determine this is a test of loyalty. Remember, Babylon has conquered a lot of territory. And there was a constant rumor of rebellion in some of these provinces. Not everybody wanted to be under the Babylonian yoke. They had to send huge tribute. They had to send a levy of their own men into their Babylonian armies. And so some of these people chafed under that rule. And there were constant rumors of rebellion. Nebuchadnezzar thinks this is a great way to smoke out the troublemakers. Now, verse 8 and later events tell us that Daniel and his 3 friends had enemies at court. After what happened in chapter 2, that we'll talk about on Wednesday, their place in the court has risen dramatically. And many of the older guys that had been at the core of Nebuchadnezzar's council, his friends, they've been supplanted, and they're jealous, they're envious. So these guys no doubt whisper in Nebuchadnezzar's ear that Daniel and his friends are at the heart of a dangerous conspiracy. They knew how devoted Daniel and his friends were to God, that they would never bow to an image. And so they think, well, this is a way to get rid of them. Verse 7. So at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, harp, and lyre in symphony with all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So here it is. The band starts playing Stairway to Heaven. We are the champions. They start playing. And what does everybody do? Everybody bows. Why? Well, because the options are bow or burn. All but 3. Verse 8. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans, the Chaldeans were the native Babylonians. These were the original Babylonians. And these are the guys who specialize in dream interpretation and omen reading and tarot, all of that. These are those guys. These are the magicians. And they've been supplanted by Daniel and his friends. And so they come running now to Nebuchadnezzar to rat them out. They came forward and they accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn and the flute and the harp and the lyre and the psaltery and symphony with all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." Well, there are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid regard to you. They did not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you've set up. At the end of chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar promoted Daniel because of what he does for Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2. Well, again, Wednesday night, we'll get into it. So he promotes Daniel, listen, to be the governor over the whole province of Babylon. When I say province, think state, like our states here in our country. There was a province called Babylon. The central capital of it, of course, was the city of Babylon. It was the premier state in the entire empire. And Nebuchadnezzar said, "Daniel, you're now the governor of the state of Babylon." And Daniel said, "Well, thank you. I'm going to need help with this. Oh, king, can I have some assistance?" "Yes," he says. "Do you have anybody in mind?" "Well, yeah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." So they get promoted now. These 4 are over this whole province. Some Chaldeans, native old school Babylonians, weren't happy about foreigners being promoted over them. So when the music played, they promptly went down and they look over to see what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are doing. And they see, well, of course they're not going to fall. They knew ahead of time. That's why they're looking over there. And they go running to Nebuchadnezzar and rat them out. Verse 13, then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I've set up? Now, if you are ready at the time that you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. Oh, but if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hand?" That Nebuchadnezzar gives them a second chance suggests that he was hip to the motives of these guys that ratted them out. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had been faithful. They had served well. There was no hint that they were traitors. And so he offers them a second chance to comply with the command to worship the image. Now, remember as well, Nebuchadnezzar has made a bold declaration. He's gone public with this, right? Listen, bow or burn. And as king, he can't look weak by backing down from that. He's got to keep that commitment, that red line that he's drawn, or he'll show weakness. And so this is why he's so angry with them. He's hoping that his rage, his fury at their disobedience will cow them and get them to comply. He doesn't want to kill them. He'd much rather they cave. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter." They mean there's been no misunderstanding. They knew that he had commanded them to bow, but they couldn't because they served an authority higher than Nebuchadnezzar. Loyalty to God trumped loyalty to any man, including the mighty king of Babylon. Indeed, it was their loyalty to God that had made them such good servants of Nebuchadnezzar. And so they tell him, verse 17, if that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you've set up. For Nebuchadnezzar, this was a showdown between his will and theirs. Between, if you will, his God and their God. This is a showdown. But for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it was a simple, straightforward test. And they knew the answer to the test. Remember when you were in high school? For some of us, that's a bigger reach than others. Remember when you were in high school? Remember you had a big test coming up? And you thought, man, if I just knew the answers ahead of time. In fact, some, you bad boys and girls, you snuck the teacher's key. And you had it written on your hand or something, you naughty. But man, if I just knew the answers, I could go into the test, it wouldn't be a problem. So listen, they're facing it in their mind. This is a test, and they knew the answer. They knew what the answer was ahead of time. The first and the second of the 10 commandments prohibit worshiping anyone but God, especially worshiping an image. And so they say to him, listen, the answer is clear. Our course is obvious to us. Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need a second chance because we'll tell you what we'll do when the music starts. We won't bow. We can't bow. And our God is able to deliver us from the furnace. And we hope he does. But even if he doesn't, we can't bow to your image. If the options are burn or bow, light her up. Friends, that has been repeated by God's people many times throughout the centuries. History is filled with the stories of miraculous deliverances from danger and death. But history is also replete with many more stories of those who became martyrs for the faith. Why some are delivered while others burn, we don't know. Why do some escape while others die? No one can answer that but God. The day is coming when all the times that we've asked why will be answered. The day is coming when our why God, will turn to worship of God. The day is coming when faith will be sight. As with Daniel last week, I want to ask you to note Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's behavior, their posture, their attitude with Nebuchadnezzar. They're humble, respectful of him. Though he's threatening them with death, he's raging at them, they don't reply in kind. They don't fire back, fury and anger. How dare you, you jerk? That's not the way they respond to him. They carefully reply and commit themselves into God's hand. We see the same humble disobedience in Acts chapter 5. When Peter and John are standing before the Sanhedrin, they had been arrested for preaching Jesus' name in the temple. And they're hauled before the Sanhedrin, the supreme court of Israel. And they tell them, you're not to say this man's name anymore. They won't even say Jesus' name. We forbid you from now on ever preaching in this man's name again. And Peter stands before this august group and says, we have to obey God rather than man. And so they released him. They beat him and released him. And Peter and John went right back to where they had been arrested, and they kept preaching the gospel, knowing that it could very well result in worse treatment for disobeying and defying the Sanhedrin. Living in a world that hates God, there will be times when man's rule conflicts with God's. When that happens, we yield to the higher authority of God, while maintaining a meek and quiet spirit in dealing with the inevitable heat that will come as a result. Friends, let's turn all the angry sense of injustice that we feel when we are being persecuted for what is good and for what is right. And yes, we do feel that way. We listen to the news about what's happening to others and we become angry. How can the people of God be treated that way? Let's turn all of that when it's directed against us. Let's turn it into worship and praise of God. The apostles, when they were imprisoned, when they were beaten, when they were jailed, it says they rejoiced that they were counted worthy to bear the name of Christ. Why did they do that? How could they do that? Because Jesus told them. He had warned them. In Matthew chapter 5, blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. I'm not a prophet. This is a non-profit organization. But as I watch the trends that are taking place in our world and the way that they seem to be speeding up exponentially, it may get to the point where we here living in Ventura County will face persecution for being a Christian. And that we will gather here on Sundays and we will gather on Wednesday evenings. And as we gather in our small groups and in our homes, it would be so easy for us to get together and to talk about the opposition we're facing at work or at school or in the public square, and to begin angry and insulting towards those that are putting the heat on. I want to ask you right now to just project yourself into that very likely future for us. And instead of being insulting and angry, picture us, Lord, thank you that you've counted us worthy to bear your name in this darkness. Because that is very likely where we are headed as a culture and where we may be headed as a church. If you're a visitor, you might be saying, well, I'm never coming back here again. I want to go to church and hear a nice, cheery word. I have to tell you the truth. Verse 19, then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury. And the expression on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain men, mighty men of valor, who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. And these men who were bound in their coats, their trousers, their turbans, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Archaeologists have discovered what they believe are execution furnaces that were used at this time. They look like a kiln. There's a hole in the top through which they would put fuel, and then a big door in the side from which they would pull out the lime or the charcoal. Well, they stoked this one as hot as it will go, and they dropped the 3 in. Verse 22, therefore, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. So picture that. They've been bound now. Their legs probably tied together in their arms so that they can't wiggle free. And now they're carried up by mighty men. These are soldiers, choice soldiers. And the radiant heat coming off this furnace is so great, it kills those guys as they're dropping them through that hole in the top. Probably because the heat in the air scorched the inside of their lungs. So down they go. If that's what happened to the guards, surely our Jewish friends here they're toast, right? Verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said to the king, True, O king. Look, he answered, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. So as the 3 are dropped into the furnace, Nebuchadnezzar expects to see them literally burst into flames. But instead, as he's looking, he sees them strolling around, probably high-fiving each other. He does a quick count. Wait, how many were there? 3, right? Well, why are there 4? And that 4th has the countenance of the Son of God. This is a theophany, an appearance of God in the Old Testament. And it fulfills a promise that God had made through the prophet Isaiah about 150 years before. In Isaiah 43, we read these words. But now, thus says the Lord who created you, O Jacob, and he who formed you, O Israel. Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, nor shall the flame scorch you. I'm sure that as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood before the raging king of Babylon, threatened with the flames, this verse was ringing in their memory. Oh, king, there's been no misunderstanding. We can't bow. Our God, they said, is able to deliver us, and he will. But even if he doesn't, know this, we can't bow to your idol. We can't bow to your image. In verse 26, we read, Then Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke, saying, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire. Isn't this fun? This is just so great. Drops them in the furnace. Their bombs burn up. They're strolling around. Hey, look, who's here? Jesus showed up. Hey, Jesus. They're in the flames. They're like, this is awesome. It's like a spa. This is great. And the king has to come. You guys, hey, come out of there. It isn't until he tells them to come out that they leave. Listen, if we're writing the story, they dropped into the flames, their bonds burned up, and they stepped out and went, ta-da, out of the furnace. No, they stay in the furnace. Nebuchadnezzar has to call them out. Why? Because they would rather be in the flames with Jesus than out with the king of Babylon. Verse 27, and the satraps, the administrators, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together. They saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. Not even the smell of fire. You've been to a beach fire. You've been to a campfire. How long do you have to sit by the fire before you smell like fire? 2 minutes. And have you noticed too, wherever you sit, that's the direction the smoke goes. It's like it can be a circle of people, and where you sit is where the smoke's going. What is up with that? You're like to the fire. There's other people here. Go smoke on that. Isn't it true? Hours later, you walked by a campfire. Hours later, what? These guys are in the flames. They come out, no smell of smoke, no hair singed. Nebuchadnezzar realized they were fireproof. He called them out. And they've risen in his esteem from being treasonous rebels to, what does he call them? Servants of the Most High God. All of the officials have gathered round. They're marveling at the miracle. No evidence of fire. Verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servant who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's words and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces. And their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. It seems that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's courageous stand has led to Nebuchadnezzar's conversion. From what he says here, it seems so. But sadly, it wasn't long before he's back to his old self and his old ways. See, friends, bearing witness to great miracles, knowing people of great faith does not mean that you will believe. Over the years, I've known many who have seen God work miraculously in their lives. They've been healed. A genuine, bona fide miracle of a healing, of deliverance from some trouble, that it was clear that God was intervening on their behalf. But they never came to faith in Christ. Billy Graham had lost friends. Judas followed Jesus. You see, the problem is not having enough proof and having enough evidence. The problem is not here, the problem is here. It's not an issue of the head, it's an issue of the heart. People prove this out when you're talking with them and they have a doubt, they have a question, and they bring it and you answer it. You give them evidence, you answer the doubt, and instead of them saying, oh, well, okay then, the barriers are gone, I believe in Jesus. You know what they do? They run to something else. They have another question or another doubt. And it doesn't matter what you say or how much evidence you pile up, they're not going to believe because they don't want to believe. In fact, they'll go away from that discussion where you have answered their doubt and their question, and they'll just bring it up again later. Wait a minute, we already dealt with that. They're hanging on to their unbelief. Verse 30, then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So the plot of those envious Chaldeans backfired. They thought Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would fry and their positions would open. But the opposite happened. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were promoted even higher. I want to end today with this. Chances are, living in an age increasingly hostile to God, we will all have our own trial when the choice is either bow or burn. And most likely, no, it won't be a literal furnace, but it will be some fiery trial. It may mean a promotion at work, a grade on a paper in school, the scorn of our peers. And when we hear stories like this of persecution, we often wonder, if that was me in that situation, would I stand or would I cave? Would I have the courage to profess my faith and face the flames? And many of us hope that we would, but we suspect that we wouldn't. That when the music begins, we'd bow and then hate ourselves for it. And we cheer Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the sidelines. I want to share a word of comfort about that. The church has a very long history of martyrs. And most of them were not people of great faith before. In fact, we would not even know of them were it not for their martyrdom. And they're just like you. They watched while others at their time were being arrested and jailed and tortured and executed. They watched and they said, when it's my turn, will I have the faith to stand? And they, like you, said, I don't know that I will. And when their moment came, God showed up. Question: was God with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, before the music played? Was he with them? But when did they see him? In the fire. God is with you. Christ is with you now. But we never see him more clearly than in that moment we need to see him. Jesus said, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. In your moment, whenever that comes, when that challenge is set before you and the world says bow or burn, know this, God's grace will be there because God is there. He will be there for you.